Kierkegaard's claim that despair is the sickness unto death is often misunderstood as a dramatic metaphor. It is not. Kierkegaard does not mean that despair leads to physical death, nor does he mean that it is merely an intense emotional state. He means that despair is a condition in which the self is unable to become itself, a sickness that concerns existence rather than the body. To understand this, Kierkegaard insists that despair must be separated from ordinary sadness. A person can be unhappy without despairing, and a person can despair without feeling unhappy. Despair is not defined by how one feels, but by how one relates to oneself. It is possible to live comfortably, successfully, and even joyfully while remaining in despair. This is why despair is so dangerous. It does not always announce itself through suffering. It often hides behind normality. People assume that despair must be obvious: anguish, breakdown, or crisis. Kierkegaard argues that the most pervasive despair is quiet, functional, and socially acceptable. Despair, in his sense, is a failure of selfhood. It occurs when the self is unwilling or unable to relate to itself truthfully. The individual does not want to be the self they are, or they want to be a self, without accepting the conditions of selfhood. In both cases, the relation that constitutes the self is distorted. This distortion can take many forms. Some people despair by losing themselves in immediacy. They live entirely in the present moment, avoiding reflection and commitment. Their lives are filled with activity, distraction, and stimulation. From the outside, they appear engaged and alive. Inwardly, they have never confronted the task of becoming a self. Others despair by identifying themselves completely with external roles. They are their profession, their reputation, their relationships, or their social identity. These roles provide structure and recognition, but they also allow the individual to avoid inward responsibility. The self is outsourced to the world. Kierkegaard believed this form of despair was especially common in modern society. People were encouraged to define themselves through achievement and social belonging rather than inward commitment. As long as one functioned effectively, no one questioned whether one had become oneself. Despair remained invisible. At the other extreme, despair can appear as defiance. Here, the individual refuses to accept any limitation or dependence. They insist on absolute autonomy. They want to be entirely self-created and self-grounded. Kierkegaard saw this posture as a rebellion against reality itself. The self demands to be what it cannot be. This form of despair often appears strong. It presents itself as confidence, independence, and authenticity. But inwardly, it is unstable because the self cannot sustain itself without acknowledging the conditions that make selfhood possible. The attempt to do so results in exhaustion, resentment, and inner fragmentation. Kierkegaard insists that all these forms share a common feature. They involve a refusal to be the self one actually is. Despair is not simply suffering, it is resistance. It is the self turning away from itself, either by dissolving into distraction or by hardening into defiance. In both cases, the self avoids the task of relating to itself honestly. What makes despair so difficult to recognize is that it often feels reasonable. People justify their avoidance. They tell themselves that they are being practical, realistic, or mature. They dismiss inward conflict as unnecessary or indulgent. Over time, this dismissal becomes habitual. Despair becomes normal. Kierkegaard believed this normalization was tragic. It allowed individuals to live entire lives without ever confronting the question of selfhood. They lived efficiently, respectably, and comfortably while remaining inwardly divided. Despair did not disrupt their lives, it quietly structured them. This is why Kierkegaard calls despair a sickness. It is not dramatic, but it is corrosive. It undermines the self from within. It prevents the individual from becoming whole, even while life appears stable from the outside. To understand despair, then, is not to catalogue emotions. It is to ask how the self can fail to be itself. and why that failure so often goes unnoticed. Kierkegaard sharpens his analysis of despair by distinguishing between unconscious despair and conscious despair. This distinction is crucial because it shows why despair can persist, even in lives that appear stable, successful, or content. Unconscious despair is the most widespread form. In unconscious despair, the individual does not realize that they are a self at all. They live without inward reflection, identifying entirely with external roles, routines, and expectations. They function, they adapt, they succeed, but they never confront the task of becoming themselves. This form of despair is often mistaken for health. A person may be busy, productive, and socially integrated. They may have goals, ambitions, and responsibilities. None of this eliminates despair. In fact, it can conceal it. As long as life runs smoothly, there is no pressure to ask deeper questions. Kierkegaard believed this was the default condition of modern life. Society rewards functionality, not inwardness. People are praised for efficiency, competence, and achievement. Rarely are they asked whether they exist truthfully in relation to themselves. As a result, unconscious despair becomes normalized. The danger of unconscious despair is not suffering, but absence. The individual is absent from their own life. They have never stood back from themselves to ask who they are becoming or whether they are willing to be who they are. Their existence is organized entirely from the outside. Conscious despair, by contrast, involves awareness. Here, the individual recognizes that something is wrong. They feel divided, restless, or dissatisfied. They may experience anxiety, guilt, or meaninglessness. Unlike unconscious despair, this form cannot be ignored so easily. It disrupts the smooth functioning of life. But conscious despair is not automatically redemptive. Awareness alone does not resolve despair. A person can recognize their division and still refuse to confront it honestly. They may seek distractions, explanations, or substitutes. They may intellectualize their condition or blame external circumstances. Conscious despair can deepen rather than heal. Kierkegaard insists that despair intensifies as self-awareness increases. The more clearly a person recognizes themselves as a self, the more painful misrelation becomes. This is why despair often grows in complexity rather than disappearing. Awareness without commitment sharpens suffering. Yet Kierkegaard also sees conscious despair as an opportunity. It forces the individual to confront the fact that their life cannot continue unchanged. It exposes the inadequacy of distraction and conformity. It creates a pressure that demands a response. The crucial question is how the individual responds. They may attempt to eliminate despair without addressing its cause. They may seek comfort, reassurance, or external validation. Or they may turn inward, asking whether their despair reveals a failure to relate to themselves truthfully. Only the latter response opens the possibility of selfhood. Kierkegaard insists that despair must not be removed prematurely. To suppress despair is to silence the very signal that reveals the self's condition. Despair, when recognized, can become a form of insight. It reveals that the self is not at rest, that something essential has been avoided. This is why Kierkegaard treats despair as both danger and possibility. Unconscious despair is dangerous because it numbs the self. Conscious despair is dangerous because it can overwhelm the self. But conscious despair also holds the possibility of transformation because it brings the problem of selfhood into view. The task is not to escape despair, but to understand what it demands. Despair demands honesty. It demands that the individual stop hiding behind roles, routines, and explanations. It demands a confrontation with the self as a self, not as an object, not as a function, but as a responsibility. Without this confrontation, despair persists in one form or another. With it, the individual may begin the difficult work of becoming themselves. Kierkegaard deepens his account of despair by identifying a form that is both more intense and more revealing: despair of weakness. In this form, the individual recognizes themselves as a self, but does not want to be that self. They experience their own existence as something burdensome, disappointing, or inadequate. This despair does not arise from ignorance, it arises from comparison. The individual measures themselves against ideals, expectations, or imagined versions of who they should be. They see the gap between what they are and what they believe they ought to be, and they experience that gap as unbearable. Rather than accepting the task of becoming themselves, they wish to escape it. This escape often takes subtle forms. A person may withdraw inwardly, avoiding situations that expose their inadequacy. They may lower their expectations, convincing themselves that nothing really matters. They may adopt a posture of resignation, treating life as something to endure rather than engage with. From the outside, this despair can look like humility. Inwardly, it is avoidance. Kierkegaard insists that despair of weakness is not a lack of strength, but a refusal to use the strength one has. The individual does not lack possibility, they lack willingness. They retreat from the risk of becoming themselves because that risk involves failure, exposure, and responsibility. This form of despair often coexists with self-criticism. The individual blames themselves relentlessly, yet this blame does not lead to action. Instead, it becomes a way of justifying inaction. By declaring themselves incapable, they avoid the demand to choose. They remain trapped in a posture of defeat. Kierkegaard believed this despair was common among reflective individuals. Those who think deeply about themselves are often more acutely aware of their limitations. Without courage, this awareness becomes paralyzing. Reflection turns inward and collapses into self-reproach rather than self-commitment. Despair of weakness reveals a misunderstanding of selfhood. The individual treats the self as something that must meet an ideal before it can be accepted. Kierkegaard rejects this entirely. The self is not something one earns by achieving perfection. It is something one must accept before it can be developed. To refuse oneself until one becomes ideal is to refuse oneself indefinitely. This is why Kierkegaard insists that despair of weakness involves a refusal of grace, not in a theological sense alone, but in an existential sense. The individual refuses to accept themselves as they are, with limits, flaws, and incompleteness. They demand to be more than human before they will consent to be themselves. This demand is impossible. The result is despair. Kierkegaard does not counsel self-forgiveness in a modern therapeutic sense. He counsels honesty. The individual must acknowledge both their limitation and their responsibility. They must accept that they are not ideal, and that becoming oneself is a process rather than an achievement. Despair of weakness persists when the individual treats selfhood as something to be justified rather than something to be lived. The way out of this despair is not self-improvement alone. It is acceptance of the task. One must be willing to become oneself without guarantees, without perfection, and without escape. This willingness does not eliminate struggle, but it transforms it. Struggle becomes part of the task rather than evidence of failure. Kierkegaard believed that many people remain trapped in despair of weakness because they mistook humility for resignation. True humility, for Kierkegaard, does not deny responsibility. It accepts it without illusion. It acknowledges limitation without using it as an excuse. Despair of weakness ends not when the individual becomes strong, but when they stop refusing themselves. That refusal, once relinquished, opens the possibility of relating to oneself truthfully. Kierkegaard contrasts despair of weakness with a more defiant form, despair of defiance. In this form, the individual does not want to escape being a self. Instead, they insist on being a self entirely on their own terms. They reject dependence, limitation, and any authority beyond themselves. This despair appears powerful. The individual presents themselves as autonomous, self-creating, and uncompromising. They refuse to accept given conditions, whether those conditions come from society, nature, or any source beyond their own will. They want to author themselves completely. Kierkegaard sees this as a profound misunderstanding of freedom. Freedom, he argues, does not consist in self-creation without limit. Such a project is impossible. The self did not bring itself into existence, and it cannot sustain itself without reference to what established it. To deny this is not liberation, but rebellion against reality. Despair of defiance arises when the individual treats the self as an absolute. They refuse to be answerable to anything beyond themselves. They do not want to receive their existence. They want to generate it. Kierkegaard believed this posture was especially tempting in cultures that celebrate autonomy without restraint. This form of despair is often admired. It can look like authenticity, courage, or radical independence. But inwardly, it is unstable. Because the self cannot actually ground itself, the individual is forced into constant assertion. Identity must be continually reinforced. Any challenge feels like a threat. The result is exhaustion. The individual becomes trapped in an endless struggle to maintain sovereignty over themselves. They cannot rest, because rest would imply dependence. They cannot accept help, because help would imply limitation. They become isolated within their own defiance. Kierkegaard insists that despair of defiance is not healed by greater self-assertion. It is intensified by it. The more the individual insists on being self-grounding, the more fragile the self becomes. The self collapses inward, cut off from the conditions that make coherence possible. This is why Kierkegaard insists that despair, in all its forms, is ultimately a refusal of relation. In despair of weakness, the individual refuses themselves by shrinking away. In despair of defiance, they refuse relation by hardening themselves. Both postures deny the self as a relation that must be held honestly. Kierkegaard does not treat despair of defiance as morally superior to despair of weakness. He treats it as more dangerous. Because it feels strong, it is harder to recognize as despair. The individual mistakes intensity for wholeness. They mistake assertion for selfhood. They remain divided inwardly while believing themselves complete. This despair often collapses only under pressure. Failure, loss, or exhaustion can expose the limits of self-creation. When the individual can no longer sustain the illusion of autonomy, despair becomes visible. This visibility can be devastating, but it can also be clarifying. Kierkegaard believed that despair of defiance reveals the deepest truth about the self. The self cannot exist in isolation. It cannot be grounded solely in will. It must relate properly to what it did not choose. Only when this relation is acknowledged can the self become stable. Despair of defiance ends not when the individual conquers the world, but when they relinquish the fantasy of absolute self-sufficiency. This relinquishment is not defeat, it is honesty. By accepting dependence, the individual does not lose freedom. They gain the possibility of coherence. The self becomes capable of resting in itself, no longer divided by rebellion. Without this acceptance, despair persists, disguised as strength, but inwardly corrosive. Kierkegaard concludes his analysis of despair by insisting that despair is not overcome through denial, distraction, or self-assertion, but through a proper relation. Despair ends only when the self becomes willing to be itself, not as it imagines itself should be, but as it actually is. This willingness is the turning point. In every form of despair, the self resists itself. It either refuses its limits, refuses its dependence, or refuses its responsibility. The resolution of despair does not involve changing the facts of one's existence. It involves changing how one stands in relation to them. Kierkegaard insists that the self must become transparent to itself. Transparency means that the individual stops hiding, not only from others, but from themselves. They no longer pretend that they are self-sufficient, nor do they dissolve into resignation. They accept themselves honestly, without illusion and without rebellion. This acceptance is not passivity, it is courage. To accept oneself is to accept the task of selfhood without guarantees. It is to acknowledge both freedom and limitation at the same time. The individual no longer demands to be more than human, nor do they excuse themselves for being human. This is why Kierkegaard treats despair as ultimately a spiritual problem. Again, this does not mean religious observance or institutional belief. It means that despair concerns the deepest orientation of the self. The self must relate properly to what grounds it, rather than attempting to ground itself or flee from itself. When this relation is restored, despair loosens its grip. The self no longer turns against itself. It no longer treats its existence as an obstacle to be escaped or a project to be conquered. It becomes capable of inward coherence, not perfection, but honesty. Kierkegaard emphasizes that this resolution is not a moment, it is a way of existing. Despair can return whenever the self begins to evade itself again. The task of selfhood must be renewed continuously. To exist truthfully is not to arrive at a final state, but to remain willing to be oneself in the face of uncertainty, failure, and limitation. This is why Kierkegaard refuses to offer techniques or formulas. Despair cannot be fixed mechanically. It cannot be solved by insight alone. It requires a transformation in how the individual relates to themselves, a transformation that cannot be outsourced, imitated, or imposed. Kierkegaard believed that most people would resist this conclusion. They would prefer explanations to responsibility, reassurance to honesty, and comfort to seriousness. Despair persists precisely because it allows the self to avoid the task of becoming itself while continuing to function. But for those willing to confront despair honestly, it becomes revelatory. It reveals that the self is not something one simply has, but something one must take responsibility for. It reveals that existence cannot be lived at a distance, and it reveals that freedom, when severed from honesty, becomes a source of fragmentation rather than wholeness. Despair, then, is not merely a sickness, it is a signal. It signals that the self has not yet come to rest in itself. It points toward a task that has been avoided, postponed, or misunderstood. When taken seriously, despair can become the beginning of truthfulness rather than its negation. Kierkegaard believed that this was the paradox at the heart of despair. Only a being capable of becoming itself can despair, and only by confronting despair can the self begin to become what it already is, a responsible, finite, and free relation. To flee despair is to flee oneself. To face despair honestly is to begin the difficult work of becoming whole. And that work, Kierkegaard insists, is the task of a lifetime.